And sometimes we allow our fear, our uncertainty, our anxiety to get in the way of the vision and burden that God has placed on our heart.
When I die, hallelujah, by and by, yes, I'll fly away. Living Truth.
This is Living Truth.
When Jesus shared the gospel, he spoke in all kinds of ways. He communicated with parables, metaphors, and life lessons. Jesus wasn't just entertaining people. He was delivering a life-changing message with language that was relevant and meaningful for the masses. In the Great Commission, Jesus tells us to go and make disciples of all nations. For many of us, we want to do more to engage the world with the good news, but it's challenging, maybe even impossible, to find the means to share beyond the orbit of our everyday lives. We live in a time when the phenomenon of media allows us to transcend borders and languages, to connect with people all around the globe in accessible ways. Living Truth is a ministry that harnesses the power of media to share Jesus with the world. For the past 40 years, we've gathered together with people from around the world to study the Word and share the good news. Through television and digital media, Living Truth produces clear biblical teaching that allows people to experience Christ in their own homes, across the street, across our nation, and around the world. For some who are unable to attend a local church, Living Truth has become their church community. God is using this ministry to reach the masses. We invite you to join us, of course, to continue to gather with us, but also to engage the world with the good news by financially supporting Living Truth. Our production team is hard at work all year long to produce 52 weeks of programming. In a ministry of this scope, there are ever-present production costs, and summer is a financially critical season for us. We're halfway through our year, and we rely entirely on viewer support to top up our ongoing creative costs and keep us on sound financial footing. By partnering with us in whatever amount you can afford and whatever frequency you can manage, you provide quality programming that communicates the saving love of Jesus to all those who are willing to hear. And every amount you donate is stewarded faithfully to send this message to the nations. We regularly receive notes from viewers living all around the world whose lives have been changed because they met Jesus or grew in their faith because of Living Truth. Without your contributions to this program, we simply wouldn't be able to share the gospel through media, locally or globally.
To offer your financial support to Living Truth, send a check to the address on your screen or call 1-888-269-6085 and make a donation with your credit card. Or you can make a secure donation online at livingtruth.ca. Living Truth is a registered charity and all donations are tax deductible. Thank you for your faithful and generous support.
Thank you for believing in Living Truth and for supporting our production costs. In this world that has both unprecedented connectedness and unbelievable brokenness, together we can go and make disciples of many, many nations. We wish you a safe and enjoyable summer. God bless you.
This sermon was recorded prior to the COVID-19 isolation mandate.
Good morning, People's Church. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to Nehemiah chapter 2. For 4 months, Nehemiah has been going through the motions as cupbearer to the king. He's been wearing his default face before the king. But after 4 months of God laying a burden and a vision on his heart, it starts to weigh on him. And he decides to step into the king's presence and remove his default face. And we read about it in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. So the king asked me, Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? Let's just stop there for a moment. Nehemiah has taken a huge risk. What God had been stirring up in private, the vision that God started to form in him, Nehemiah is now bringing it out into the open. But kings don't want people who aren't happy around them, especially during a banquet when wine is being served. And because he is the cupbearer to the king, oftentimes his function was to taste the drinks or the food before it went to the king, just in case someone was trying to poison the king. So when Nehemiah passes him the cup, Artaxerxes says, "Why is your face so downcast when you're not ill? You're not ill, are you, Nehemiah? There's nothing funny in this drink, is there? Why do you look so sad?" And Artaxerxes shows concern. He says, "This can be nothing but sadness of heart." What God has laid on Nehemiah's heart is now coming out into the open. And we read at the end of verse 2 that when Artaxerxes says can be nothing but sadness of heart, we read that Nehemiah says, "I was very much afraid." See, God was laying a burden on Nehemiah. He was giving him a vision. But Nehemiah didn't know how it would work out. God hadn't told him the complete game plan. Yes, God was the one authoring the burden in his heart. God was the one moving in his life. But Nehemiah didn't have a master playbook. He didn't know if he was upset before the king, whether the king would cause him to lose his life. He didn't know how this was going to change his life. All he knew was that God was stirring up a vision within him. And I love the honesty and transparency of Scripture. I love that Nehemiah, when writing this story and recalling what had happened, includes that he was very much afraid, because it reminds us that we can receive a vision from God, but that doesn't mean we aren't going to go through the normal human emotions of fear, times of anxiety or uncertainty. God can be, in fact, directing and orchestrating our lives, but when we can't see what's on the other side of our obedience, we might be on the other side of it wrestling with uncertainty. As I was reflecting on this passage this week and thinking through Nehemiah's story, I was reminded of my own journey into the People's Church. And God and I had some conversations about this past week and felt that he was wanting me to share a bit of my own story that led to me coming to the People's Church. And to be honest with you, I was hesitant to do so. I didn't particularly want to, but feel like I can trust you with this story. I had gone, as many of you know, into a one-year mission trip in the city of Philadelphia and had returned from that missions experience in the year 2000 and was living in Toronto and working in urban ministry with Urban Promise Toronto, a ministry founded by Colin McCartney in our city, and enjoyed doing that for 17, 18 years. And upon my return from Philly, I was a part of the People's Church, attending here, and I was getting ready for a Sunday morning service. I was sitting up in the balcony right over here, and I vividly remember while I was sitting on the balcony, it was 2001, and I was getting ready for church service, and God said to me, as clear as you hear God speak to you, you will speak on that platform one day. 6 years had passed by since that whisper by the Spirit up on the balcony. And on the day that my grandfather died, Charles Price emailed me, invited me to speak at 3 Sunday evening services in 2007. And I remember the significance of that for me. On the day that this man had passed away, who I respected so deeply, I remember praying and saying, God, all that he represented, a walk with you and a desire for your word and that others would know it, may that be true in his children, his grandchildren for generations. And so I came and I preached on this platform on a Sunday evening service in 2007 at Charles Price's invitation, a fulfillment of what God had whispered in the balcony 6 years earlier. And then about a year after that, I was sitting down here on a Sunday morning, just over in one of these pews. And while I was sitting there getting ready for Sunday morning church, my wife was dropping our kids off at Sunday school. And in a similar fashion to the voice I had heard in 2001 when he said, "You will speak on this stage," as clear as day, God whispered to me, "You will be the next senior pastor of this church," while Charles Price was getting ready. And I sat up and two things popped into my mind. The first thought was Zechariah and Mary. Zechariah said, "This is impossible," and was struck with silence. And Mary said, "Let it be so according to your word." So I said, "Let it be so according to your word. I don't want to be struck with silence." And I just said, "Lord, my life is yours, whatever." Now, I hadn't told anyone about the journey or the experiences or the encounters that I had had leading up to that moment. And about a year after God whispered that, it was about 2009 when I heard that message, I told my wife, I thought I should probably tell my wife, Stephanie, so that she's aware of what has happened in the past and what this current word is from God. And so I shared it with her, and she just smiled and kind of freaked out a bit and went, "Oh my goodness, I can't even fathom that." But she said, "Whatever God wants." Like Nehemiah, I knew with clarity that God had spoken, that he was stirring up a burden, that he was placing a vision within me, but I was very much afraid. And I was walking away from what he was calling me to do, but that's the thing about God. When you read the story of Jonah, you can run in the other direction from the vision that he's laying on your heart. He will not let you get away with it. He will pursue you, and there is nowhere you can run where he is not already there. And so I knew that I was walking away from what he was calling and burdening me to do. He had given me burning bush moments. But I had uncertainty. I was anxious. I couldn't see on the other side of the obedience what would happen, what would it be like. I had a perception of what it meant to be a pastor. I thought I would have to wear pleated khakis and sweaters and stuff like that. And I was thinking, that's not me. I'm an urban missionary. And I remember having conversations with God, and I had met with Charles, and I had said, "You can put my name back on a list," and that turned into about 30 hours of interviews with the board and Charles and others, and talks with some of the staff and team here. And I remember in my own prayer times thinking to myself, "Lord, this is impossible. It just does not make sense," because he hadn't given me the guidebook. He hadn't given me the template. I couldn't see on the other side of the obedience. All I could see was fog. But I knew God was calling me to take a leap and trust that he was the one orchestrating events. And I remember saying to him, "God, how is this possible? How's it going to work? How does that even play out?" And he would only say one thing back to me, 2 words: "I am." "Brett, don't worry, I am." And I'd see, "That's great, you are, but what about me?" Nehemiah's about to experience a life-changing moment, and what I love about the scriptures is that he's brutally honest, that he is terrified. He is very much afraid. We see the same thing in Moses' calling. We see the same reality when Esther goes before King Xerxes. We see the same notion in Nehemiah's life, in the life of the apostles. And sometimes we allow our fear, our uncertainty, our anxiety to get in the way of the vision and burden that God has placed on our heart. And maybe you're here this morning, and you know exactly what it is God's calling you to do. He's laid a vision on you, a burden on you, and you're allowing your fear, your lack of clarity, your uncertainty to get in the way of stepping into the fullness of all that God has for you. Nehemiah takes a huge risk, and he is very much afraid. But the king presses in for some answers to why his face is so downcast. And we read in verse 3, I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? You notice Nehemiah doesn't say Jerusalem. He says the city where my ancestors are buried. He's doing that intentionally because in Ezra chapter 4, when the exiles had attempted to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, governors of the surrounding region, the enemies of God's people, had written letters to Artaxerxes to get them to stop the rebuilding of the walls. So in Ezra chapter 4, Artaxerxes himself had issued a decree that the walls of Jerusalem should never be rebuilt until he so orders. And here you have Nehemiah appearing before Artaxerxes, effectively asking him to overturn his previous decree. And he's asking quite a bit of this king. He's compelled by this vision, this burden that God has laid on his heart, but he's taking a tremendous risk. And in verse 4, the king replies to him and says, what is it that you want? Nehemiah, you've brought a problem before me. The king of the city of your ancestors lies in ruins. What do you want to do about it? Look at verse 4. Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. Then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple and for the city wall and for the residence I will occupy. What I appreciate about Nehemiah when he appears before Artaxerxes is that for 4 months, God had been stirring this vision. He had been laying this burden, and Nehemiah had been praying through all that he felt God calling him to do. But like a wise leader, Nehemiah at the same time, while he's praying, is making preparation for the vision that God has called him to carry out. Nehemiah appears before King Artaxerxes, and when asked, what do you want, has already thought through a timeline of how long it's going to take so that he can present it to the king, and also has calculated the resources required when he asks for access to the king's forest so that he might rebuild the walls. He was making careful preparations to carry out the vision that God had called him to. He was prayerfully, strategically discerning the vision that God had laid on his heart. And he asks for a lot. We learned from Nehemiah chapter 5 that in this moment, Artaxerxes grants his request and then some. He makes him governor of Judah, so he gives him political power. He also grants him letters with the king's authority, and he also gives him a cavalry and soldiers to go with him. And Nehemiah receives all this, and he's overwhelmed by the gracious hand of God upon him. But Nehemiah chapters 1 and 2 remind us that we are to pray and prepare for the vision God has laid on our heart. St. Augustine puts it this way: pray as though everything depended on God, work as though everything depended on you. Nehemiah has been praying as though everything depends on God, because it does, but at the same time, he's making careful preparation as though it depended on him. And he steps out with the king's permission. And I love how Nehemiah articulates the reason why the king was so favorably disposed towards him. We read it in verse 8. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. God has birthed the vision, God has confirmed the vision, and God is the one who has given me the resources. It's not because of Nehemiah's fancy pitch. It's not because of Nehemiah's position and charisma with Artaxerxes that this is all taking place. This is taking place because the gracious hand of God was upon him. Nehemiah's faith is in God. Artaxerxes is simply the means through which God is enabling him to carry out the vision he's laid on his life. And so Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem, and in verse 9 we read that he went to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and a cavalry with him. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. As we read about in Ezra, the surrounding regions of Samaria had wanted to keep the Jewish exiles under their thumb, had lobbied kings of the Medo-Persian Empire to make their work difficult, had persecuted them, and had written to King Artaxerxes to stop the rebuilding of this city, Jerusalem, because of their hatred for God's people. And now Nehemiah rolls into town. He's got political power because he is now the governor of Judah. He's got letters that describe the king's authority. And he's got army officers and a cavalry with him, and they are very much disturbed that Nehemiah has come. And what that reminds us is that we might be carrying out God's vision. We might be doing exactly what he wants us to be doing, walking in obedience to him. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy, and it doesn't mean we won't face conflict when we're carrying out his ministry. There is pain involved in the ministry. Because as you read through the rest of chapter 2, Nehemiah starts to inspect the wall. He continues his careful preparation. He looks at the gaps. He assesses the situation. And then he assembles the people of Jerusalem, and he says, let us together rebuild the walls and remove the disgrace that is hanging around us. And he tells them his story about how God's gracious hand was upon him and how God has given him political power, the authority of the king, to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And the people are overjoyed and start to rise up with the vision, confirming that what God is stirring up is in fact God at work. And they start to get energy and momentum towards fulfilling the vision that God had laid on Nehemiah's heart. But what we read about in chapter 2, verse 19, is the following. When Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing, they asked. Are you rebelling against the king? And again, we are reminded that if you have a God-given vision, confirmed by others like King Artaxerxes, confirmed that the gracious hand of God is upon you, you will most certainly face spiritual warfare and conflict. You might be walking in exact obedience to God. It doesn't mean everything's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that you're not going to face adversaries. And what we see in these three is that they begin by mocking and ridiculing the vision of God. Not the vision of Nehemiah. God is the source of all of this. But they choose to mock and ridicule Nehemiah. And we see this play out throughout the scriptures. People who are walking in obedience to the vision God lays on their hearts, facing opposition all the time. We read about it in 1 Peter. The Apostle Peter writes this: if you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer, a thief, or any other kind of criminal, or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. You might be walking out in the vision God gives you. It does not mean it's going to be easy. You will face spiritual warfare. Jesus says this: blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The Apostle Paul writes a letter to the Corinthian church, and he describes certain aspects of his ministry, a man who walked with God as an apostle to the Gentiles. And look at what he writes down. To this very hour, we go hungry and thirsty. We are in rags. We are brutally treated. We are homeless. We work hard with our own hands. When we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. We have become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world, right up to this moment. How's that as your ministry description? Who would like to sign up and join his team to walk out the vision that God had laid on his heart? You might be here this morning and you are being exactly obedient to what God has called you to do. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. We have a very real adversary who pushes up against us. So let me close with these thoughts. Maybe you're here this morning, and like I said, you know exactly what God's calling you to do. He's given you a vision for your life, but you're allowing your fear, your uncertainty, to get in the way of your obedience. While you're waiting for that vision to manifest in your life, are you making the careful preparations? Are you praying, but are you also preparing for what God's calling you to do? And do you realize that when you step out in obedience, you're stepping onto a battlefield? So just be ready.
To watch this message again, visit our website. Download transcripts, order DVDs and CDs, as well as our daily devotional, or sign up for our monthly newsletter. Online, you can sign up for podcasts. You can also join us on Facebook and YouTube.
Join us next week for part 2 of this series with Brett McBride and a message titled The Hard Work of Vision. This is Living Truth.